Hi, this is Randy from BokehImage.com and Dread242.com. My analog project 2011 continues in the month of June with the Olympus Pen EE2. This camera was released by Olympus in 1968. It's a 35mm half frame camera, and if you don't know what half frame is, half frame basically gives you double the exposure on a roll of film because it's half a 35mm frame. So if you're shooting a 24 exposure roll of film, you'll get 48 shots, and if you're shooting a 36 exposure roll of film, you'll get 72 shots. So to further show you what I'm talking about, we'll bring out a 35mm camera here. We'll pop the back open and show you a 35mm frame. This is 35mm frame right here. So looking at a half frame camera, you can see that the frame is half the size of that 35mm down there. So it's roughly half the size, this being 35mm and this being a half frame. So it does present some unique composition and framing challenges, but it's not like in a bad way. It's fun, you know. It's a totally a doable, fun type of framing to do. Half frame is, you know, I don't want to say that it's popular. You don't see it that much unless you're in the lomography world. You'll see it quite often in that case. Here, let me show you something else just to further show you half frame. We'll take this white sheet of paper, and here we'll show you, here's a roll of 35mm film with regular 35mm frames on it, and this being this is the some test film here. This is half frame, so you can see the difference in the two. You have half frame on the bottom and full frame 35mm on top. So that's basically half frame, half the shot of a 35mm. Fun cameras to use regardless of the brand. Anyway, this is a Olympus Pen EE2. It features a 28mm lens that shoots at f 3.5. The camera has two automatic settings. You have an aperture priority setting and an ISO priority setting, which is selectable on the lens barrel. All right, so the camera also has two fixed shutter speeds. When you're shooting in aperture mode, you have a shutter speed, a fixed shutter speed of 1/40th of a second. And when you're shooting in ISO mode, you have a fixed shutter speed of 1/200th of a second. So this camera also has, like I said, it's a 28mm lens, but it has a focal distance that's somewhere between 12 and 15 feet out because it's fixed focus. So there is no focusing with this particular camera. So when you're composing your shots, you have to keep in mind that it's sharpest at somewhere between 12 and 15 feet out, and then beyond, also taking into account the aperture that you're using. So when you set this camera to aperture mode, the camera automatically selects the 1/40th of a second shutter speed, which I found to be most useful. But this camera, I believe, has a dying light meter, which is behind this photo cell right here, because when I set this camera to ISO mode, and it's supposed to give me a shutter speed of 1/200th of a second, and I'm sure it's doing that, but it was preventing me from taking the photograph. It locks out the shutter release button if it detects that it doesn't have enough light. The manual actually brags about the fact that this camera cannot take a bad picture, and it does that by preventing you from taking the picture, and I think that's kind of a cop-out. But when I set it to, I put a roll of 400 speed in here, and I set the ISO to 400, and every single time the shutter button was locked out, and it was preventing me from taking a picture. And in fact, if you look inside, let me get this little piece of paper back down here. If you look inside the viewfinder, you can actually see a red tongue pop up, or a red indicator telling you that it is not going to let you take the picture. And I found that to be the case whether I was shooting 400 speed, 200 speed, 100 speed, and even after putting the film in here and playing with the ISO setting, trying to trick it into allowing me to take the picture, it simply would not let me do that. So I spent the entire test roll when I first bought this camera shooting in aperture mode, and that worked out fine. So there was really, you know, not much to complain about. And if I had a choice, I would prefer the aperture mode anyway. This aperture mode is not necessarily for getting a great depth of field and bokeh and all of that. It's simply, I think, used to regulate the amount of light that's coming through the shutter and exposing the film. at 1/40th of a second in bright daylight. There ain't much you can do when it comes to playing with the aperture to for artistic flair when it comes to blur, bokeh, and depth of field. This camera features a flash hot shoe on the top, a very attractive frame counter here. I don't know why, I just love looking at that. It's just maybe because it looks like an old school gas gauge or something like that. And then you have the film rewind crank, the film crank, the advanced release button to rewind the film back in, and a tripod mount on the bottom. Very simple camera to operate. It's a nice street shooter when in aperture mode. I found it to be very easy to use. The camera has a very lovely, let's see if you can hear that, very lovely shutter. I don't know why, but I just love the sound of this particular shutter on this camera. But because of the dying light meter, once again, aperture mode only on this camera. I'm sure other Olympus Pen EE2s probably work just fine, but you know, this light meter wasn't designed to last as long as it has. You know, considering that several decades old, you know, I'm shocked that it still works as little as it does. And I have several other vintage film cameras where the light meter does work with no problems. So there you go, the Olympus Pen EE2, made by Olympus, released in 1968. I'm shooting with this one all month long in the month of June for my analog project 2011. You can find the photographs on dread242.com, bokehimage.com, and maybe on Flickr. So have a look around there, and all of the previous photos from previous cameras that I've shot. So join me next month when I'll be using another one of my vintage cameras in this photo project. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next month.